And so as you know, you read a hodgepodge of things for today, and you can tell me just how hodgy-podgy it was. But Jeff is the only one of my colleagues either gullible enough or unbusy enough or something to join us, and it might have been too much of a free-for-all if more had. But the idea is to think about how a history department works. So that's what we're going to do. But Anne-Marie, do you want to start us? You're our official starter today.
So I don't know what everybody read, but
oh, let's actually do that.
do that. Does everyone want to go around and announce?
We could just say
We can raise
hands.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So how many of you read the John Dower? Okay. So about 4 of you. And how many of you read the Coachman? Okay. Again, a little over half. And what else? Let's see. The Peters piece in the Journal of Early Modern History on, what is it called?
Chinese frontiers.
Yeah. Empire and Nation in Comparative Perspective.
We read it last term, yeah.
Okay, so 2 of you have at least read it. Okay. That was really good, I have to say. How many of you read Meg's piece on Bring on the Meat? How about some meat? Okay, again, about half of you. And how about Harriet's Race, Breed, and Myth of Origin, the Chillingham Cattle? Skimmed. Okay, so a couple of you. And then the Widows, a couple of you read it. Okay, good. So I think we're covered, right? And then there was the other piece that I had written with John Jurdy that gave you another sense of sort of what's happening in the quantitative history field. And I guess, 2 or 3 of you read that? Okay. Okay, so now, I think we're covered, though.
Yes, we're covered.
Okay.
So I think the easiest way to kind of try and talk about all these pieces was kind of to look at the way they analyze the data that they're concerned with, because I think there's a lot of different methods at work here, like Professor Ravel's and also Professor Dower, I think, are sort of more kind of what I traditionally regard as history, when you take sort of an event or some sort of facts that you have, and then the historian locates it in the period and makes some kind of subjective conclusions. But then the pieces we read by you are far more sort of quantitatively intensive, and there's regressions and data and numbers. And in a way, when you first look at that kind of a data,
like lions and tigers and bears.
I think when you look at historical data presented in that fashion, it often comes across as being more objective, because it's kind of detached. It's something analytical. It's something quantitative. So I was just curious what people think in terms of how the method that you choose in evaluating data kind of influences the conclusions that you draw, and kind of how historians project their own kind of inferences on the data they have.
Go ahead, Ian.
I read the Not So Merry Widows, and I thought that the data, the fact that using like very quantitative data itself didn't necessarily add extra credibility, but what I thought was very noticeable was the way you turned a critical eye towards the data and conclusions you drew through that. And I mean, I think that's something that. So I guess I'm saying that maybe it wasn't so much the fact that it was just using numbers and regressions and bears, oh my, but that it was that you were critical of how the data was being used. And said, well, but this, I drew this conclusion because of these numbers, but it could be misleading because, or when you determining the age of individuals, kind of an artifice to do that. I spent the first half of the paper wondering if that would come up with anything abnormal because of that, and then you kind of answered that towards the middle and end of the paper.
I spent about 3 months trying to decide if that was going to skew things. I don't know, Germana and then Peter.
For me, the other thing about the data is that you were very careful about talking about where you got your source from and how that itself might have skewed it a bit, since it was only from families where both of the parents died. And even if they had died, like, it only talked about second marriages if that second spouse had died as well and stuff like that. So the fact that you were really critical about the source of your information also gave you a lot more credibility.
Let's hold on to that. I mean, we'll get you, Peter. But hold on to this idea of what it means to be critical about your sources, and let's apply it to the cultural history, and think about what it means to be critical about sources in some other context where maybe it's not so apparent. But before we do that, go ahead, Peter.
I was going to say the exact same thing.
Oh, okay. So for those of you who read The Coachman's Bare Rump.
He's also very critical about the sources at the end in terms of, well, both the sources, if you look, but he didn't just take the first thing that they got from the police reports. He went back and looked, and there was a police report 3 weeks later about it that's completely different from the police report of the first one, and so it's sort of, and so you have to compare both of those and did actually look into what might have happened, why they sort of conflicted and such like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
But I think it's harder to be critical of sources when they're cultural like that. I think when you have numbers and hard data, I think it's, I don't know, you don't need to bring so much opinion to it.
What do you think, Jeff?
I think that's an interesting comment because in some ways the cultural historians and the quantitative historians, well, sometimes they overlap, are quite mistrustful of each other, and I think there is an assumption amongst quantitative historians that anything that can't be quantified is much more problematic and open to skepticism. I think cultural historians suspect that numbers can be manipulated as easily as narratives and images in the service of biased history.
Yeah, go ahead, Mara.
And either way, even with both quantitative and the cultural stuff, you still are forced to look at what kind of skew the actual, wherever you're getting the data from. Like for Professor McCants, like the fact that it was from Richard, for that the class of people who are giving the testimony does definitely change how it should be held and that kind of stuff.
Okay, so if we were going to think about these two particular problems, I mean, and one of the things that's interesting about these two pieces, and maybe Harriet's too, those are the three papers that were in the pile that you could choose from that were the most narrowly focused on a sort of specific problem. So in my case, it's a specific question. Why do men remarry more often than women? Right? And then of course, there's a multitude of questions that come out of that, but it's that specific question. In Jeff's case, it's, wow, this guy's got a play thing going in his house, and it ends up, in a police report. And what does that tell me about the individuals who are participants in the evening's festivities and then anti-festivities? What does it tell me about their social class? What does it tell me about theater going? What does it tell me about French politics, right, in the 18th century? I mean, et cetera. But it comes out of this very specific thing. And in Harriet's case, we've got these cattle that are being sort of projected as ancient that aren't the least bit ancient, and why, right? It's very, whereas the John Dower piece is very largely about how images of race get used, right? It's a much bigger problem, and Meg's piece on the meat is actually much more narrative. It's not focused around a question per se, right? It's telling you a story about how, in this case, an agency kind of rises and falls. I guess there's definitely a, they emerge on the scene and then they disappear, and then Peters is this huge, right, comparative analysis of 18th century empire building, around the world. I mean, it's primarily focused on Qing movements into the Tibetan frontier, but he picks up the Ottomans and a whole European literature and all sorts of other stuff, right? So those are much broader. But if we go back for a minute to the three that are kind of case sensitive, we can ask questions about the historian's methodology in finding evidence often inadvertently, right? Yours was inadvertent, wasn't it?
Well, it's just the first report is published in a 19th century collection of documents from this archive,
Okay.
and in the course of going through that for another project, I happened to
Okay.
stumble across it.
Inadvertent, right. And mine is the same way. I was doing something else in the archives of this particular orphanage and discovered that there were all these probate inventories that were just kind of lying around. And in fact, my first response to that material was to write to my thesis advisor and say, hey, guess what I found? This would be a great dissertation project for somebody. Why don't you suggest it to one of your students? And, and then like another year later, I think I talked to him again. So have you found anyone who wants to work with those probate inventories? And a year later, does anybody want to work with them? And finally, it sort of dawned on me, oh, well, I guess I could go back and work with them. But, it has that kind of accidental find of something, which you then can think through. Well, what are the questions that one might want to pose of this box of materials that have come to me somewhat inadvertently, right? It's not that it's not that there was some agenda to ask those specific questions and then to go searching for data, but rather to have sort of found data and realize that it opens up some interesting possibilities. But okay, so aside from how we come to these things, which is often quite accidental, and hopefully you're going to make this discovery in your own papers, right? That you're going to be reading away and suddenly there's going to be material that wasn't what you were looking for, but that in fact has all kinds of potential to say interesting things about the world and the past and so forth. But so in these, if we're going to think about sources, if we've come to sources accidentally, and we know that they weren't recorded in the first place for the purposes to which we are now about to put them in this setting of writing an article, how can we evaluate, methodology aside, right, be it cultural or quantitative, right, how can we evaluate the veracity of the historian's interpretation or the legitimacy of the historian's interpretation? I mean, the policeman who comes to the Chevalier's villa, or whatever, is it a villa?
It's just a large, luxurious house, townhouse, let's say.
Okay.
Yeah.
He has no grand designs at all, right, to speak to the problems of race and class and social status, right, in Ancien Regime France, right? So is it okay for Jeff to do that? Yeah.
Well, in a way, isn't it good that the policeman has no intentions to speak to class and social structures like that? Because that gives you an unbiased account on his part, right? Initially, in the first part, I mean, upon reading the second document, when they've covered it up, I think that's more speaking towards at least class structures in a way. But I don't so much see a problem with using a source that wasn't specifically addressing an issue you are trying to investigate as being legitimate.
I think depending on how broad the source is as well, because I mean you mentioned with the probate documents and the orphanage that they were broader than most probate documents, and you could ascertain the purpose for which they were written down, and it was broad enough that it contained within it, that it didn't have some, it shouldn't be lacking something important that would. But I mean, I guess that is the big danger, is to make sure that the police officer just isn't used to ignoring certain facts that you would assume that he's. But I mean, and that's something that's kind of hard to. I mean, and again, maybe in terms of the probate, if they were just not used to writing down facts about people of a certain economic status, they're like, oh well, that's obviously not a problem. I mean, it looks like you ascertained that wasn't the case, that they actually did record everything, but it could have very well been you found this document and they were just omitting certain things because it wasn't important for them. So I guess you just need to. And I think it's even harder with the police documents as well, or a little, maybe harder, maybe easier, I'm not sure, but it just requires a lot of investigation into the nature of the source.
If I could have had one other source, if you as a reader would have liked me to have had one more source to add to the picture, complete the picture, complicate or confuse the picture, what would you have wanted me to have? What should I have fabricated in the archives? These are fabricated.
What would Natalie Davis have done?
Let's just assume.
There was a fairly significant groundswell of anti-Davis sentiment in this class. That John Demos's unredeemed captive came in as sort of higher on the veracity scale than Davis.
What didn't you guys like about Natalie Davis's book? Did she read too much
Projecting
into
her thoughts onto the
Bertrand?
characters without really making a distinction of when that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they just didn't trust her. Well, what would you guys want? What would?
In my piece or in any of the other ones you read as well?
I don't know if this exactly applies because I read The Dower.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually taking this class right now too, so it's kind of interesting because I basically heard the lecture on that Monday.
Aha!
And
Good timing.
yeah, I really thought that the piece could have used a couple of the graphics he used in class to substantiate what he was saying because the graphics he had in class were just like it was so clear looking at these, because it's about the racism towards Japanese, and here's a picture of Hitler and Mussolini, and they're about this tall, and here's the Japanese guy that's half their size, and it really makes a strong point as to what he was trying to say. And I thought that having like a separate, not just text, but adding the picture would have really helped prove his point.
Go
I
ahead.
thought with Meg's one that really made a difference. With Meg Jacobs' one, that she had these pictures where it's like, it was meant more like before, like when she'd say, "Oh, well, they're trying to do this propaganda," I was sort of detached about how over the top the propaganda was, and then you see these pictures, and they're just so like. Nowadays, they think of it as parodied almost because they're just so comic, and I think it just really helped push the point to sort of how strong these things were going.
To answer Professor Bell's question, I think you make a lot of points as to the relationship between the servants, or I don't know what the proper word for them is, and Villiers, is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
So if there was some sort of document that could have, like a diary or something that would kind of, because you suggest that maybe, he had a favorite servant, and that there were all these possibly, interactions between the servants. If there was some kind of diary from one of the people in the house that actually says what the home life was actually like, I mean, it's unfortunate that one doesn't exist, but that could help explain if there was just some pent-up animosity between a couple of the servants, or if it was something broader. Because I believe that it was something broader, but it could have just been, a personal feud. And I think if something like that existed, it would have.
Yeah, no, I think there probably isn't anything like that, but the reason why I haven't published this is that I'm still not very happy with how much I know about the master of the house, and I know there are places where I can go poke around in Paris to find that out, and I think by learning more about him, about the sources of his wealth, some other things I might be able to have access to, I then might be able to draw a little bit broader and richer picture of that household. And so, yeah, I think to my mind, that's the one documentary weakness right now in this piece that I want to fill in before I try to get it published somewhere.
What did you want to say, Mana?
I was just, because he said that the graphics that Dower used, and that's what actually really I liked about Meg's piece, is that that's really the way she lectures. She has these great graphics that completely support and add to her points.
Let's talk about images then, okay? Because Nick's first claim is that once the images are up, right, it's all clear. It's there, right? It's compelling, and I mean I'll overread into what you said to make the point, and then we can back away from it a little bit, but. The image and our understanding of the image is something that speaks for itself, right? Or that has that potential to be so powerful that it speaks, for itself. That all I have to do is see that Hitler is tall and the monkey man is short, right? And there it is, right? It's a kind of a tableau for me to understand how racism in World War II is playing itself out, right? One of the concerns that, say, the quantitative historian might have, right, is that well, I mean, thinking about the early modern period, we have a large collection of, preserved artworks, right? And one of the tropes, I mean, just to go back to the widow piece for a moment, I mean, one of the tropes that's out there that's both literary and artistic, right, is the remarrying widow, right, who, is cavorting and gallivanting about with younger men, and it's all very inappropriate and so forth, right? And then the question is, if that image, in fact, this article originally had an image when it was, or had 2 or 3 actually, when it was in paper form and being presented, and then of course when it went off to the stuffy journal, all of that got, some journals will take pictures and some won't. And the Journal of Family History has no use for pictures. This is a very sort of quantitative gang, and part of what I was doing with the pictures was actually using things that the quantitative evidence suggests are wrong. And I was sort of doing that deliberately. But we could be suspicious that Professor Dower has, for your, beguilement in Monday's lecture, right, put up the pictures that are maybe not representative. I mean, the problem is we don't know, right? And they're very powerful. That's what sticks with us, especially our culture. We're much more visual than perhaps earlier cultures. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Kind of similar to what Rifo does as well, because she puts up these imposing pictures of cattle, and then she's like, well, I'm going to tell you why it's probably not true. That, or at least the story behind them isn't true. So I guess images can't always be taken at the face value like that.
Well, I mean, that's certainly her claim, right? That the images have been manufactured deliberately, in a way, right, to be misleading. Now, not to be misleading to us. The point about them was to be misleading to their contemporaries, right?
Or
to create an image of something.
They were made by misled people, almost.
Well, but we could say that about, these sort of racially charged images that come out of World War II propaganda as well. That they were misleading even at the time. Maybe not deliberately, maybe not self-consciously, but if Dower's point that the racism is so embedded, right, that people can't even see it, if that's true, then the images are both proving the point and making the point dangerous simultaneously, right? Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, I don't really see how that's too much different than just like other sources, like the actual images from the time. Because, I mean, like with the cattle, there were sources saying, these are ancient and, magnificent and all that other stuff. But, like, a picture speaks to us and, that's sort of like our perspective on it. But I don't think, like, you can categorize them as being more dangerous, like, when looking at them as references than any written work.
Go ahead, Annie, and then Miranda.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, it's the whole thing. It's just interpreting, right? If you have the pictures of these married widows jumping, that says something about those times, right? That people somehow wanted to think about that, and that's like a different question almost than the one you answered, right? It's like a different. You're talking like social history there, like why was this an important image? Why did whatever? So I think it also depends on like what you're looking at it, and it's the same way with like the political cartoons from World War II tell us something different. It tells us something about the way people were thinking. It's more like social history, and I didn't read the cattle piece, but apparently the same thing. Like, these people wanted to believe it for a reason. Like it was important, and there was a reason behind that. And so it's like understanding two different things, right? One is like the facts of like what was actually true, right? The married widows were not so merry. And the other thing is like social history, like people wanted to think that they were married widows for some reason or another. So I don't know, I think.
Depends on.
I mean, that's one thing the historian can do, right? Is say, all right, I've got this range of evidence. It comes in different sort of methodological formats, and some of it seems to contradict each other. So I have quantitative records that suggest that widows are economically disadvantaged. I have a iconographic tradition and a literary tradition that suggests that widows are sort of running around having a great old time because they're widows, right? And they've gotten rid of that bothersome first husband. They've inherited
got his cash.
They've got his cash, right? They've inherited the fortune, and now they can run around with younger men, right? And I could take both of those pieces of evidence, and I could say, wow, this is really interesting. That first of all, in some sense that there was a truth in the past, they can't both be true, or at least they can't both be true for the same people simultaneously, right? So it's possible that there's just two groups. There are poor widows, and then there are romping around, rich widows, and just ne'er the two shall meet, right? I mean, that's one possibility. Another is what you've just suggested, Annie, and that is, well, maybe society is afraid of the one, even though it's not so common, and ignores the other because it's so common and it's not representationally frightening. And so the one is going to show up in cultural sources, and the other is going to only show up through this kind of, careful digging in fiscal records that were gathered for some completely different purpose, right? And I mean, in a way, that's how I've tried to think about the problem. But it's nonetheless a cautionary, right? Because visual images have such an impact on us. I mean, maybe what would be really great, if you couldn't get the diary, maybe you should make up some drawings of the events, and that would be good too, right? Because then you could have a great picture, or two or three.
Well, in fact, there are several great pictures of precisely this object. They're not French sources, but there are a couple of great British sources. One, a sort of conniving Italian opera director who outfits his main diva with a false rump that exaggerates its curvaceousness, and he's fitting her with it. And then there's another one, a political cartoon of Walpole from the early 1740s, of everyone having to, he strides over the entry to government, and everybody has to climb up a ladder and kiss his bare rump that's exposed before they can go on in and get an office in the British government. So, I mean, Christelle my wife has suggested that to her it seems like the 18th century might better be labeled the century of the rump for these reasons.
Okay, you go, Miranda.
I think there's a problem also with pictures. You have to be very, very careful also with numbers because, we're so used to thinking numbers, thinking pictures are much, much more powerful. Mm-hmm. But in fact, I think a lot of society is just completely controlled by numbers. Like, you can say, and there's a real problem because people are like, well, the scientist said this, so it's true. Mm-hmm. And you can get, 30% of these, the problem of saying that they had the social scientists of World War II saying, well, by our science we've proven that, mm-hmm. that they are less smart than us and mm-hmm. something like that. And it's sort of, if you put out a number like 33% of people are this, mm-hmm. people will almost automatically accept that. And a lot more times, it'll be a stronger thing than it's saying, well, a bunch of people are like this. And so I think you have to be, and a lot of science things are really, a lot of these numbers they're not fuzzy, but they're like, there's a very, very small margins to go. There's not a, all right, this is 100 and this is 1. And so it can be really, you have to be as careful, I think, with numbers as with pictures of, mm-hmm. being very careful of what is the percentage that says, okay, this is a true fact, this is not a, mm-hmm. and you address that in the thing of saying that, that you did address that problem in your thing of mm-hmm. at one point.
Yeah, the part about the pawn shops where this percent happens during the winter months and random thing would only suggest this much.
Right. Yeah. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Yeah. Right, is saying what would we expect? And how far do we deviate from what we expect, as opposed to just giving a number. Gosh, 30% of all the pawns happened in the wintertime. right? And then, oh yeah, but like 30% of the months are in the wintertime, or something like that, right? I mean, 25%. There we go. That'd be a better number. But I mean, that's an excellent observation, and you guys presumably are, numerically literate enough, or numerate enough. Should I say that? Can I say that? Numerate. You guys are numerate enough that you think of those things, but lots of people actually don't. But Ian, are you responding to this?
Yes, pretty much. Just saying that that this seems like it is, or a lot of these seem like they're addressed to a very academic audience of perhaps quantitative historians, and and something that we can access pretty readily, being numerate. And I just don't. I don't think that there was a big point to this that's kind of I don't think that the danger. I think that we're more likely, and quantitative historians and us, people who are able to really understand what's going on, are also correspondingly much less likely to take it at face value. Are much less likely to
read it critically.
Because people at large are very trustful of statistics.
Yeah.
But people who understand statistics, who can know what's going on, aren't at all. And,
No, that's true. That's true.
and that kind of mitigates the risk
Yeah.
of numbers.
Yeah. Go ahead.
To connect to that, going back to Holy Feast, Holy Fast, I think there's. I know we all want to get
Book
back
that
to that
won't
piece.
go away.
I mean, even though that's not published in a historical journal. That's actually put out onto the wider market, right? And she uses statistics that are very fuzzy, right? I remember her saying, and 63% of a sample the size of 9.
Right.
And
That's right.
And I think
I think that was your objection, wasn't it, Miranda? At one point, yeah.
The fact that this is in a book that has a national circulation, and therefore I would think, more people, I don't think there's many people going into a bookstore and picking up Holy Feast, Holy Fast randomly to read it for their entertainment, but still, it has a broader circulation than, say,
An
an article
academic
like
journal.
this. And so I think it's more worrisome that you have these fuzzy statistics in a book like that than, say, if you had them in an article like this where the readers are going to be more discerning. Is that?
Yeah, it's not entirely clear to me that these journals are more or less obscure than the readership for something like Holy Feast, Holy Fast. But no, you're absolutely right. There are plenty of places where historians want to make a point, or any kind of rhetoricians, journalists, scholars of any kind want to make a point, and they know that if they were really pushed on it, they wouldn't put too much stock in their percentage, but by golly, it's good to report it because it sounds powerful. So of course, that's everywhere. Yeah, Peter.
Historical journals, anything like the scientific journals, are they refereed and things like that? Because then you kind of get. Because I know whenever I'm looking for stuff for scientific classes, like textbooks, you can pretty much in any textbook you can find blatantly wrong information because they're not refereed. So I guess you kind of trust what you read in a journal more, because if it's refereed, somebody's read it, and presumably some authority in the field has read it and said, well, this seems good enough for me. So to me, it would be good enough for my purposes that if there are numbers, then I'm going to trust the trends that they predict.
That's
gotten through there.
That's an excellent question. Everything you read today has been refereed except for Professor Ravel's piece, which has been completely fabricated, and that's why he's unwilling to publish it. He didn't want me to tell you that. But that's a really good question. The typical journal process that I'm familiar with is at least one and preferably 2 referees. With a book, it's typically 2 to 3 or even 4. Is it sometimes 4?
If
it might be.
The publisher is not very sure about what's going on.
Right. And so, the process is supposed to be anonymous. I do a fair amount of refereeing for the Journal of Economic History. And I know the field of economic historians reasonably well, so I get anonymous articles, and I know exactly who it is, right? But the process is, in theory, anonymous, and I think, obviously, it must be often in practice, and especially in fields that are really big, like French cultural history. Presumably, it is more anonymous because there are many more practitioners out there, so the random element increases. And the idea is indeed that a specialist has been found who, in my case, usually I'm being called on to evaluate somebody's quantitative techniques to make sure that that there's not some sort of egregious, either deliberate misapplication of something or just an egregious oversight that would sort of bring the conclusions of the article into question.
Yeah, but I think also I'm sure in your field as well as in other fields, that part of what the referee's task is not just to make sure that methodology has been properly followed or to assure the absolute truth factor of the conclusion of the article, but in some cases just simply to provide a useful, stimulating, provocative new argument that the journal, the author, and the editors then hope will generate more discussion and more controversy. So I think that in some sense it's not so much the truth value as I'm just thinking of, I'm going to start a 2-year stint as an editor of a journal called Studies in 18th Century Culture. And we get a lot of submissions that are hashing over old territory, and I'm not interested in putting that stuff in there. I want some new ideas, even if I have some questions about whether they're right or not, because I think it's going to stimulate further discussion and contributions to the field.
I mean, that's the other thing that the reviewer should be doing, is asking the so what question, for sure. Yeah, Anne-Marie.
But what happens if the referee completely disagrees with an interpretation? Does the paper
there's a procedure called revise and resubmit. And at some point, the editor has to make the call as to whether the reviewer is right or the author of the article is better off. Has a stronger argument.
The typical thing that happens, I think I speak probably for all of us in the department, is you send an article off, you're pretty pleased with it by the time you finally get around to sending it off, and you're certainly relieved, right, to have gotten rid of it. And months go by, because it takes forever for the reviewer to get their review back to the journal, and we're all guilty of this on the other side too, right? So we literally send these things off and forget about them, because they're going to be gone for a long time, and then finally they come back, and often, I don't know, maybe this doesn't happen to you, but I read the reviewer's comments and I think, what a complete idiot! How dare so-and-so, whoever so-and-so is, right, and it's anonymous, how dare they say these ridiculously stupid things about my article? And then, then the process is, I think, often one of coming back from that, of saying, well, maybe there's some merit to it. And I mean, and sometimes there really isn't, right? They've asked you to use data that don't exist, for instance. I mean, that happens to me a lot. Well, it'd be really great if the author did X, and I always think, yeah, I agree. Should I make it up, right? It would be wonderful. So, I mean, it's that process is a dialogue, and I don't know, does this happen to you? Do you get mad when reviewers' comments come back?
They all sound brilliant.
Oh.
No, same thing happens, absolutely.
Anyway, yes. So for the lesser mortals amongst us, but the process. I mean, ideally, Peter, the process should be an iterative one, in which at least two parties and possibly more are pushing against each other. I mean, another common problem is that two reviewers' reports come back and they disagree with each other, right? And then you think, okay, great, what am I supposed to do? I really just want to get this thing published and off my desk, and out of my mind, and so forth.
But that's pretty instructive too. I mean, I remember with my first book, people read it and offer you comments, not just the readers, that the press gets to read it, but you have friends and colleagues whose opinions you respect. You ask them to read it. And the upshot of getting maybe a dozen or so of these comments back was that at some point, everybody contradicted everybody, and I either had to do everything or delete everything from the book. And at some level, at some point, that liberates you to say, I can't satisfy everybody, but these comments guide me towards what is the central argument and the main merit of the book, and that's what you pull out in your final revisions, and that's what you try to stress.
So let me ask you a very different kind of question. all of these things you read are by people who are currently teaching in the department here. And presumably many of you have had many of them? Yes? Not yet? Now you're dying to go have more courses with some of them, right? Or maybe not, I don't know. Part of my sort of higher agenda in asking you to read these things was simply to get you thinking about, what are the local resources? What do they look like? Who are these people that teach at the institution that I happen to be at? And my guess is that overall you read fairly little by your professors, because we're all kind of shy and reluctant to make you read our stuff, I think, or mostly. In fact, when I told Harriet Ritvo that I was doing this, she said, "Oh, you can't assign your own piece. That you can't do." So it was okay to assign all my colleagues, but I wasn't allowed to assign. And I said, forget it. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to give them something in mind too. But I think there's a reluctance to do that. So part of it was just, for your edification, but also, Ben, because I printed yours out, I couldn't resist reading the first sentence, and it was great. Can I share this with you guys? Do you mind if I? Okay. It says, "I don't claim to be a full-blown historian, not yet at least, so there's a chance that I missed some grand chain that connect the works of some of the history faculty together, because if there was one, I missed it." Okay. I just thought this was really great. I mean, what does anything hold all of this together?
Historians.
Okay, we all happen by virtue of a whole bunch of accidents to be employed here.
It's like asking what holds the physics department together, because there you have nuclear physics, quantum physics, you have all these different things, and these are all so highly specialized, so I don't really see what the problem is.
Well, except that physics does manage at least to teach 801 and 802 and sort of believe that there's some coherent curriculum, yes? I mean, I hope there's a coherent curriculum to 801 and 802, otherwise an awful lot of people have suffered in vain.
And I've seen it in some other schools, what they'll have for the history department is or most definitely what you get in high schools and stuff from the beginning is basic world history, which tries to start from Neanderthals and go on, and and then a little bit more specialized. You get American history and European history, and they go basically by region, so that you can get a sort of general sense of the region and such. I mean, there's always the problem of what mattering by what school and where you go to. You can get very specific ones, or you can get people who are we're doing basic world history, and they'll jump from Neanderthals, Rome, a little bit of Middle Ages, Renaissance, and then to
the 19th century.
American history, and it's and then maybe a little bit of World War I, II, and Vietnam, and that's it.
Plato to NATO, that's
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That's great. Plato to NATO. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, I think reading some of these helps explain some of the subject offerings in the department.
Yeah.
Because,
I hope so.
Because it's interesting, because I've had Polly Meyer a bunch of times. And, I took her, basic classes first, and then, all of a sudden, I took her American Revolution class, and we just threw everything she ever wrote at us, pretty much. So this is why you're teaching this class, because what you know best. And I know Professor Ravel teaches some kind of French class, or...
Some kind of French
class.
We serve cheese and wine.
What's interesting is, I know he also teaches Latin American history, so it's kind of interesting to see, because when you look through the curriculum and you see all these names, and up until this term I really haven't put many faces to it, because I've only had a couple of professors, but it helps explain, I didn't realize, and you with all your numbers, but believe it or not, I don't like numbers even though I go here. Your paper kind of scared me, but I can understand, all your economics.
Yeah, the progression jumped out also.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know what this means. I'll take your word for it, especially because you're an MIT faculty, so I think we're more likely to believe a quantitative historian at MIT than a quantitative historian at, Yale or Princeton or something.
Some of us aren't likely to believe them anyway.
Lots of us aren't likely to. Okay, I mean, clearly the subject offerings that get into a catalog, right, at any given place are going to be driven by two pressures. One is some sense that will be either greater or lesser at different institutions depending on how they're funded, right, and how they're run. But some sense that there's a curriculum that has to be covered. So that's the Plato to NATO piece, I guess, right? And at the same time, and maybe in conflict with that, there's going to be all the idiosyncrasies, how do I say that, of the individuals who teach there and what they want to do. And so, what Harriet really wants to do is to teach a class about animals in the 19th century, right? She's dying to do that. She's been talking to me for years about, this sort of hypothetical animal class that she really wants to teach. And, you can imagine, to sort of pick on a stereotype, but sort of a big state school, a provost or a dean saying, "What? A class on animals in the 19th century? You've got to be kidding me. We've got stuff we have to cover, right? We have to teach Western Civ, we have to teach global history, we have to teach Asia. After all, it's a big place, and even though we never used to do it, we really ought to, or something like this, right? And so maybe the animals in the 19th century course never goes because these commitments are so overwhelming. But at MIT, right, the animal course is eventually going to happen. You will.
Yes, or the British royal family, which is a tiny, in terms of, of overall scheme, it's a really tiny course in terms of materials. It's really so
exactly. And those kinds of courses reflect very much, the things that we're interested in doing, and that have grabbed us in their sort of arcane particularities.
I wonder if we could come back to Anne-Marie's question, or comment, which was, well, it didn't really bother her that there seemed to be no core or center. Was that the response that the rest of you had, or maybe some of you discerned a commonality in all of these readings?
I think it's a good thing. Kind of thinking about other departments. It's kind of like having no core shows me that the professors are here in history, following their passions, what they want to do, and I think that's the same as an engineering professor. My advisor does fluid; she doesn't do mechanics. And having talked to people about history and gone through the Plato to NATO history in high school, I think that you lose a lot of people and they miss the point of history. It's not, this happened then, and then this happened. It's not dates. It's more about, why did this happen? What were these people really thinking? And I think that this is a more effective way to cover it by having really specialized areas.
You may not cover it.
Well, you may not cover, cover everything, but knowing that, the Romans invaded, attacked Carthage in 100 BC doesn't make you a better historian, doesn't,
But possibly it makes you a better person. Go ahead, Miranda.
I half agree and half I really like that. The sort of what interests a lot of people in history, including myself, I've seen, is the very specific facts. I really loved the taking as a my American Revolution just because it's so small of a subject and so interesting. Getting through one tiny subject and really delving in. And yet I feel like a lot of times I've lost a bunch of things. I would really love to learn to have, not the basic Plato to NATO, but maybe sort of by region of, a basic thing of English history and, of Wales and Ireland and Scotland and all that sort of, or a basic thing of, overall of one country's sort of emergence and such. And I feel like you sort of, what you want is this, there's a step between the Plato to NATO classes and the very specific classes that I feel like is usually missing. Is the sort of a medium-sized version.
See, for me, in high school, I ended up doing the very specific thing of America in the 60s. So I kind of skipped the Plato to NATO thing. I never did it.
That's unusual, though, isn't it, in a high school curriculum?
Oh, yeah, it's because I ended up taking it at Duke instead of at my high school.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I just completely skipped the history thing in high school.
Wise.
Well, that, except for Hawaiian. I didn't do the specific Hawaii history thing. But anyway, but when I came here, I actually did, they had middle courses. for regions, because I took mostly Middle Eastern courses, and they really do a really nice in-depth job of doing overall view of history in the Middle East and like a little bit of the outside stuff. But what I found was since I stayed so much in the Middle East, I'm taking a poli-sci class, and the connections to the outside world are kind of what lost. Things I know these things happen, and I know what happened in this area, but what was happening in Europe, completely clear.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems, and presumably this is a problem in physics too, since, right, that's a discipline that's been brought up. Ideally, we would all know lots about everything, and then really a lot about a few things, right? In fact, what turns out is that we know a little about not quite everything, and then a lot about the specific places where we're doing research or where we've done a lot of teaching, and so our reading has been very in-depth or something like that, right? So the problem is an information management one. And presumably that's a problem in physics too. It's just that it might be because of the way curriculums have been established, and maybe especially at MIT, that the knowing a lot about everything, that piece happens at least momentarily, in that kind of first year sequence, so that people can say, yes, I've had physics. I know what it is. I at least know what it is that I'm supposed to know, even if I can't remember how to do it, right? Something like that. Whereas it's not clear what you would take in history that would give you that feeling at the end of the freshman year, let's say, that you could go out into the public and say, yes, right, I've had that. I know what it is I'm supposed to know, even if I don't remember all the details. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, just mentioning that whole overview of knowing everything just reminds me of Braudel for some reason.
Well?
Like if there was a Braudel for every part of the world, I think that would be kind of similar, because he took this pretty big this is a pretty big region and a pretty big thing, and he laid it all out for you in a nice take-home size book. And
We'd just be reading for the rest of our lives.
But I just thought of that, and I guess it's possible, but we all seem to think that Braudel was a little nuts, so I guess it's not.
Well, this came up last week as well. Nick, I think it was you who said that when you were reading The Discarded Image, that there was this whole world, right, of literary references that were just at the tip of Lewis's tongue, right? That left you, the reader, thinking, well, this would all be great and compelling if I knew what the hell he was talking about, right? But I don't, because I haven't read all of this, and possibly if I'd read all of that stuff, I couldn't have read all about the use of the camel and the dromedary on different parts of the Mediterranean coast, right? Because it's not possible unless we go with Anne Marie's suggestion, which is that we do nothing but read for the rest of our lives. Right, which is not a bad suggestion, right? And in fact, I think is perhaps, that may in fact be the distinguishing curse of the professional historian. Does that sound fair to you? Well, Jeff spends a lot of time watching baseball games, but aside from that, that there's this sense of always needing to read more, right? This paper can't be published, for instance. Why? Because
I have to go do some more archival digging.
Right, and that there's more to the story that hasn't been uncovered yet, or there are connections from this story to other stories, and so on and so forth. So imagine, if you will, that this history department had geographic and chronological coverage, right? And you've got some smattering of geographical and chronological coverage here. Not great, though, really, right? If we think about sort of all the times and all the places that aren't represented here. And that it's not, it's the case that I don't have all my colleagues, but even if I had given you something from every single one of my colleagues, we would still be missing lots of times and places. But let's assume for the moment we've hit the big ones, right? But we were all working in sort of the same methodological frame. So I don't know, we were all doing political history of maybe of the Meg Jacobs variety, and that is that we knew something about in this case, governmental institutions that were relevant for that particular time and place, and we could explicate them, and hopefully we would have good pictures to go with them as well, right? The thing I like about this article is it's a couple of really great pictures, right, in search of a narrative, and then Meg supplies a really great narrative. But one can completely imagine in this case that you start with the pictures and then figure out how to build a narrative around that.
Yeah. No, I was just going to ask, is the selection of what gets taught here and who gets chosen to teach it completely random, or to your minds, are there certain times and places and topics that must be taught at MIT in 2004?
Go ahead,
I
Ben.
think MIT is really good about having region, like they at least have one person that covers a different region. So I mean, there's a Middle Eastern, there's someone who teaches the Middle East, the Far East, Europe, America. I mean, so the overall, I don't think we have South America.
Well, that's Jeff in his spare time.
Yeah.
Okay. So
When I'm not watching baseball games.
Yeah, and Africa is problematic.
Or
Yeah,
Australia too. Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead,
I
Ben.
just wanted to say that I actually think the American history is covered pretty well. Like you have Pauline Maier's to like whenever to Civil War,
Right.
and then Civil War on, and then she also teaches the American Revolution, and Professor Mary Smith teaches the Civil War, and then Professor Jacob teaches World War II and afterwards. And I don't know, like with regards to American history,
We
I
got all
actually
the big
think,
wars covered.
yeah, I got all the big wars
Okay.
covered,
Oh,
and all the
talking about
depression.
2 centuries.
and-
I mean,
yeah, well,
not all that
that's
challenging
very
to cover.
true, but I also think that American history is pretty important, especially in
America?
America, yeah. And so I was just think we got that covered decently well.
Which I always find amusing is that at MIT there's a law and society class, and then the history department has law and society in American history.
Where's the law and society class taught?
There's anthropology.
In anthropology.
And they're two
history.
completely different classes.
Yeah.
Sylvie, I guess, who teaches that.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. So, but those are both fairly new in the curriculum. Those are both. I mean,
Newer professors too.
new to MIT. Right. Right. Well, I mean, this is another huge issue, right? And that is people who are at the margins of disciplines, and history tends to be a discipline that picks up and also drops off, right? Lots of people at the margins, right? So they're, I mean, in my case, right, it's economics and history. In Elizabeth Wood's case, it's political science and history. In Harriet's case, it's literature and history. In Bob Fogelson's case, it would be basically sociology, I guess, and history, right? And so we can, it's a discipline that tends to collect people like this who either belong here but also belong elsewhere, or belong elsewhere but can put a foot in here. And I think there are fewer disciplines, other disciplines that are as malleable that way, right? Because, and all of history of science.
Spread, though.
Yeah, it is
Now
starting to
we have
spread.
Like for bio, right? You have bio, then you have bioengineering, which kind
That's
of
right.
gets into materials and science
And the
engineering.
biochemists, and aren't there now like biophysicists?
Yep. Biophysicists, it's just everything. You have your biology and computer science classes, modeling on computers.
But is
everything's very
biology the glue that's holding it together?
Depends on which perspective you're coming from. You're a computer scientist.
Well, the reason I ask that is because I think there are some interesting disciplinary parallels, right? I mean, let's, for the sake of argument, say that biology then becomes another one of these nodes where lots of stuff comes in at the edges, or biologists trickle out, right, at the edges. And if we thought about history as one of these nodes and biology as one of these nodes, what is that telling us? I mean, in some sense, these are the sort of the very inclusive sciences, right? And biology can make this large claim to being the study of life processes. Well, gosh, what a surprise. Life processes turns out to have something to do with everything, right? And history can make the claim that it's the study of what has gone before. And gosh, what a surprise, right? It turns out that the study of what has gone before has something to do with everything. So you can have history of science, and you can have history of economics, and you can have history of art, and you can have history of bones, and you can have history of coins, and you can have even, the history of geophysicists, right? I mean, the possibilities for thinking about interdisciplinary projects is endless, right? Because everything has a past, and you could think about that past in connection with sort of the larger past. And if we've given the larger past to the history discipline, then they can have their fingers all over, just like the biologists turn out they can have their fingers all over. Yeah, Ian.
I think part of it has to do with the method of problem solving that different disciplines teach, and like that history teaches a way to look at certain problems and to come up with answers, do research, come up with answers, present them in a way that people will understand and accept. Like computer science is equally about problem solving, about finding computational ways to solve everyone's problems and
or to make them,
by the same token. And I think that's just same thing with rhetoric, or with people who are if you're few people are career writers, but people with the same field. If you learn the techniques of writing persuasively, then you can apply yourself to anything. It's just about what problem-solving techniques are unique to a field, rather than necessarily the subject matter.
Okay, so let's try that. Let's say that the history department at MIT is not held together geographically. It is not held together chronologically. That's good, right? We don't want it to be, because if we were, then we wouldn't have coverage. Right? And coverage is a good thing, in the way that Ben has already articulated. By golly, the Americanists at least have coverage, right? The rest of the world's looking spotty. Okay, so that's not what's holding us together. Ian suggests it's the way we answer questions. It's our methodology. Now, are you convinced of that? You've read 6 things.
I'm not too convinced. Because, I mean, if I just look at 2 pieces, I look at Meg Jacobs' piece, and I look at your piece. And Meg Jacobs looks at pictures and says, I'm going to tell you why these, she has all these posters, and you say, write a narrative to it. You look at your piece, you see all these women cavorting around, and you're going to say why this isn't true. So,
I don't know.
I mean, it's not so black and white, but I think that, you take an approach, you look at numbers, or you look at trends through quantitative.
But is that incidental? I mean, what Ian was suggesting, I think, is that there's something fundamental about the way both Meg and I ask and answer questions, and the fact that Meg has these great posters, which, let's face it, I just don't have. Otherwise, I'd be using them too. And I have a quantitative methodology. Maybe that's surface noise, and that there is something that holds Meg and I together that's more fundamental, or maybe not, right? I mean, that's what you guys need to assess. Miranda.
I think that there is a little bit of something, which is not, it's just based sort of by, and I think it's very specific by by where you go. Like MIT's history department would be very different from another place's history department, and like there is some separations in like the physics in terms of quantitative versus theoretical, but it's sort of, what are you teaching them to do afterwards? Like, there's sort of the push of the history stuff, I feel, of, the point is to learn, not basically to learn a specific, thing, or else you're going to be like, okay, well, you don't really need to do, a general sense, just study American. The point is to learn how to analytically look at these things and write papers and teach from this. Well, if you have a physics thing or a computer science one, you can have the, okay, well, if you're practical, then you're quantitative, you're like, all right, this is the way you make a program and use it, to something like that, versus if you're theoretical, it's how do you manipulate all these equations to figure out these different problems. So it's more, what are you teaching them to do afterwards with this? And I think that that sort of gets
Afterwards, what? Meaning,
After,
what are
study.
all you going to grow up and be?
Or just like how we use the information we get from this class. Not really, not into, yes, you're all going to be historians and go into your little various areas and study deeply. But more just
God
like,
forbid you all become historians. The market is terrible, let me tell you.
like, it's not like you're taking one, if you're trying to study, and like for history, if you're trying to specifically teach history as in teach the facts of one area or one time period or something like that, this is not the way to teach it, because you're saying, okay, well, in fact, we want you to take things from different time periods and take different things like that. Well, I could see other places going, well, the point is to teach you about this one spot or one time or one idea, and really focusing on that.
I think there's a bit of there's potential for that. If you really did want to study American history here, and you could do a history major here and basically only take American
No,
history.
you have to take other. You have to take at least
Okay, well,
four from different.
I have no idea what I'm talking about.
you have to take for the minor, you have to take American, European, and some other area.
Yeah.
Well, regardless of my idiocy, I think that you still have historical posing and researching and answering questions in a historical context still has more in common than and this isn't again something that's necessarily specific to the MIT history department, but something that's saying is
what is it, Ian? Well, you believe there's something that makes Jeff, Meg, Harriet, myself, John Dower. There's something that makes us historians. Now, superficially, we all have PhDs in history. Right? And that helps. Right? Maybe that's it. We've all gone through a credentialing process, and so we're living in this sort of elaborate fiction that we have something in common just because we tell ourselves we do. But we don't. But you seem to really believe that there's something that we share in common despite our ostensible differences. And we should try to tease that out. Go ahead, Mana.
I actually have a comment that Professor Van Everen in the poli-sci department made, and it made me realize that there is something really in common to MIT history professors. Is that they are very different from history professors anywhere else.
According to Steve Van Everen.
According to Van Everen, because he went on this entire diatribe about how historians, on the first day of class, how historians are not very useful for political scientists because they just do these specific events and they're supposed to be individual and unique in history, and therefore historians don't want to follow these big patterns and these kind of stuff. And I found that really unusual because all the history classes I've had here do believe in making you think about if people act like this, why is it, and how does this affect later on?
Can we tell her about why political scientists are not very useful for historians?
I already got that. That's just in my college. I had to take a Has D that wasn't in the history department.
Okay. So let's parse that. Let's parse that claim out. Although it'd be great to have Steve here so that we could be fair to him too, right? But what I'm hearing you report him saying.
Oh no, but then when I talked to him afterwards about MIT, he's like, yeah, people at MIT do it differently. I was talking about more in general because I was comparing this nice legend.
Okay, his take on historians writ large with a capital H, right? Not necessarily his colleagues here, but the rest of them. His take on that is that historians are driven by narrative. Yeah. That they tell stories. And after all, story is in our disciplinary name, right? It is. Just like life is in the biology name. And so their big claim to being part of everything is that, after all, they're about life. And our big claim to being part of everything is that we tell stories, right? And we've incorporated it into our identification of ourselves in the very language that we use to describe ourselves. The corollary to that is that we don't do analysis. Right? That's, I think, what I'm hearing you say. The social scientist, according to Professor Van Everen, who's not here to defend himself, the social scientist looks across large phenomenon and analyzes them. The historian tells narrative details.
Yeah, that was his complaint. But when I went up to him and asked him, because I took a class by Maslesh, who actually was very good about doing like an analysis and that kind of stuff. So I've actually found that at least the majority of the professors I've had at MIT are very good at the overall analysis type of thing. So that might be why you all end up being at MIT.
Why is that a good thing versus a bad thing? That's the problem I have, is that of course there's the thing of, well, if it's narrative, then it's not as good as if it's quantitative. And in fact, I really loved Jacob's piece because I could just get the whole story from the beginning to the end. Well, like, I had problems with the answering one because I was just like, I'm confused of where I am. I'm absolutely lost. Like, because I just didn't really get the culture from around it, and then see that with
now see what's great about that
it just scared me.
Is that when I read Meg's piece, right? You know, what am I writing in the margin already? What's the question here? What's the question? Why do I care about this story? Right? I mean, not in a mean snide way, the way I just said it, right? But that's my reaction to the narrative. And I mean, if we go back and we think about Braudel again, right? Braudel's in this sort of, well, category unto himself, in which there is no narrative, clearly, right? We're not going to do that. But also, the analysis is kind of not the normal one either, because it's not like we can pick up the Mediterranean in the age of Philip II and say, what's the question here? Right? We could write that in the margin too. I mean, there are a million small questions, of course, maybe 4 or 5 million small questions, but it's not immediately clear what the big question is, right? Whereas in my piece, hopefully, the big question is really obvious. I mean, it's small, but, you know, and that is, you know, how do we interpret the propensity or non-propensity to remarry? In Peter's piece, right, the analytical mode, the two of you who read it in the past, did you read it in Peter's class? So Peter violated my first principle of our faculty being reluctant to assign their own stuff.
It was just Pauline Mayer.
That's true.
She gave us basis for revolution.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, and Maslesh had us read a lot of his books too.
Oh, well, you see, then just some of us are too shy, obviously.
But just not counting on that royalty revenue stream from.
That's it. There is no royalty. But Peter's piece would fall into sort of I mean, it's very clear right from the beginning. What's the question he's asking? Right? He's writing absolutely in the analytical mode. Okay, but Anne-Marie, you've had your hand up forever, and I keep ignoring you. Sorry.
I was just actually going to ask the two of you, because we've kind of been having this discussion. I think, and what it boils down to me is almost sort of like, why do history, right? Like, are we just doing history for the story's sake? I don't think that's why you do history, right? I don't think you go into the archives just because you're going to find some neat little facts that are going to be amusing. I mean,
no, because if we did, then we would be antiquarians. And that we could say with complete condescension, right? Oh, antiquarians, right? People who just love old stuff because it's old.
So isn't there some sort of, I think there is a general trend in history to try, I guess going back to Vanevra, I disagree with the statement that historians don't locate things in a general trend. I mean, I think that to me is the whole point of history.
Why'd you become a historian?
Well, I have two responses to make to this and to this general turn of the conversation. One way I think that we might talk about commonality that wasn't touched upon is that for historians, the one necessary component of what we do is an archive. And each of us in all of these articles configures our archives in different ways. It isn't necessarily a brick and mortar building with pieces of paper that are yellowing and make you sneeze inside. And so one way one might approach this question is what is an archive and how does each historian configure it? But as to the question of, what good is history anyway, besides being one damn thing or another, after another, I think in both teaching and in the research and writing I do, history is interesting and important and goes beyond the anecdotal and amusing or the antiquarian because it offers a unique perspective on the present, on the moment that one lives in. And I think the great merit of history, the great excitement of history, is that contact with the past when you perceive both how similar it is and how really ununique and unoriginal we are today in comparison to all that has gone before, and yet at the same time when you also perceive that people thought and did things in a very different way that we could have never conceived of in a million years. And so to take stock of who we are today by that constant querying of the past is the most important task of the historian, in my mind.
I think that's what Ian was kind of trying to get to in this underlying methodology. I think that's kind of what you just
Is it, Ian? Is that what you were trying to say?
Exactly. The words are inside me. I think that's fairly, you know, that is at the end of where I was going. I'm not sure. I think I was kind of looking for a more something more in terms of a framework of research, like something more specific. But I mean, I can't. I think I'm clearly not interested enough with this history department to be making broad claims like this. But,
well, it's okay. Professor Van Ever does. So.
It's a profession in a whole.
As a whole, that's right. No, we're going to give him a hard time the next time we see him, though.
That's why I liked Dowers a lot, was because it really gave me that. I was like all the reading of, you know, well, the ideas that, you know, that Americans, of the mysticism and stuff like that, and I've been really thinking about that particular because a lot of friends of mine are, you know, sort of getting into what I feel like is the cult of, you know, martial arts, of basically, oh my god, everyone, you know, sort of ignoring, well, we also fought too, you know, we have nice broadswords and fighting, but, you know, there's this sort of, this special thing of people always wearing, like, you know, yin-yang signs and seeing Zen is more
so how does that fit into Dowers' interpretive apparatus for racism? Okay, past and present.
I think it's interesting that it was the idea of the switch of the sort of both that you can have something that you can look at as both as almost, you know, that this is better than what we have, but also that it's so different that it's weird and wrong and something. And it's sort of the switch between, you know, during World War II of that, you know, well, they're mystic and therefore, you know, there's something wrong with them, versus nowadays where it's more of the mystic and therefore something special. And I think that's sort of interesting, that he was sort of talking about the switch of that, of, you know, things that, you know, you say they're mystic and it can be a bad thing and a good thing at the same time, just mattering by where.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Marie.
I think Dower is interesting because he's the one piece we read that I think tries to most clearly locate what he did in today's world, because he addresses the issue of Japanese versus American emerging industrial dominance, and he really tries to locate this question of racism in this kind of globalized world today. And so even in his last sentences, he kind of tries to take the analysis he's done in these pages and project it onto the future. So I think that...
Okay, but let me ask you a question. Is that because his subject matter is closest in time? Or is that because he is, let's say, the only one who is, or, you know, the one most self-consciously thinking about Jeff's connection between the past and the present? Right? Do you want to respond to that, Nick?
Yeah,
okay.
I think it's more the latter. I think he's subconsciously connecting the two, because he was talking Monday night about how you know, one of the things that he really saw with this is that, you know, intelligence got fouled up by, you know, our opinions of the Japanese, and you know, we really underestimated and misunderstood what we were going up against. And he connects that right to, like, you know, probably one of the most modern things right now is this whole John Clark, Condoleezza Rice thing, and just saying how he thinks that one explanation is that the administration had this 1980s mindset that, you know, they were going up against nation states as opposed to terrorist groups that really don't have a nation, don't have a leader, and so they just misunderstood the intelligence like that. And so I think that doesn't really, the fact that World War II was only 60 years ago doesn't, I don't think it relates to it.
And then Meg Jacobs is about the same time too. It's about World War II. I mean, it doesn't go past that much just past World War II, but it has the same feeling of the these are basic policies that are still happening nowadays. The whole problem of Social Security, welfare, how much the government gets involved or not.
But is that because it's close in time in terms of its subject? Right. So, and Peter, did you have your hand up in the back of my?
Something else. So continue.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think so, because I think it's a lot. It's like I think you can easily fit Professor Ravel's one still in there because it has, it's a sort of what is the study in terms of theater in the social class. Now it's harder to fit it to nowadays because there's been this sort of the overall change, or at least the wish of changing in terms of the racism and in terms of the class structure. But I think that it can still be fit in of, comparisons of what happened then versus now.
Well, Jeff starts with something on CNN.com.
Yeah.
How much more with it can we get?
It's true.
Peter, I don't want to abandon wherever it was you were going to go, but I want to follow
Keep going.
up one thing. Let's go back to that poor holy feast, holy fast for a moment. When we were talking about it, one of the things that bothered some of us, I hope I'm not misremembering, was in particular the chapter that drew the parallels to anorexia and modern, if you will, psychological interpretations of female, often, behavior of fasting or starving oneself, right? And that was problematic. Am I remembering that correctly? That there was at least some murmuring about... Now, we could argue that what Bynum is doing there is, despite the vast, almost millennia that separates her material from us, she's trying to do the same thing that John Dower did in lecture on Monday night and say, look, we could actually learn something about intelligence gathering in the 1980s by looking at intelligence gathering in the 1930s. And it's possible that we are generous to John Dower because that, it feels okay. It's not such a long time away, whereas Bynum's, let's face it, this is a leap, right? It's a huge chronological leap. Or is it the case that John Dower's done it well, irregardless of how much time either did or did not elapse, and Bynum did it sloppily?
But I wasn't a party to your conversation about Bynum, but didn't you, when you were reading that book, at least think about issues of anorexia and bulimia that haunt, Western industrial and post-industrial society today? I mean, wasn't there that point of contact in that book? I don't know if that came out in the conversation
that's
or
what
not.
I thought when I read it. I was like, you're anorexic. That's the first, when you read about someone who doesn't eat for 7 years, that's the first thought that pops into your mind, right? Obviously they have an eating disorder, they're not eating.
Yeah, when I read about someone who hasn't eaten for 7 years, I think they should be dead. But that's the materialist, quantitative historian in me.
From a modern perspective, that's the first thing I think.
Okay, Peter.
Well, this is what I was going to say before, but actually when I read that, I never made the connection until she did. And I don't know, I'm trying to think of why I read it differently. But the first thing I thought of was religious fanaticism and not a modern day. I didn't connect it at all to modern day things, because I think the fact that I read something that this person didn't eat for 39 years except for bread and water, I was like, I think the first thing I thought was, this isn't true. And then the second thing I thought was, well, it's probably something that wasn't fabricated, but elaborated because of religious fanaticism. But I don't know if anyone else agree. I don't know if anyone else didn't make the connection, but I never did until she brought it up.
Yeah, I also had that because I felt more that because what you've learned always with anorexia and stuff like that is it's more on self-image of trying to look pretty or something like that. That's sort of the culture of what it says. Is point of anorexia. Then versus fanaticism and religious stuff, which is more what it sounded like this thing was at. Like, you don't hear people nowadays saying, I'm going to fast specifically because of religion as much, at least not, you know.
Yeah, we
But
do.
it's not, I mean, not,
But there is a
that's
kind of
doesn't
moral
connect it with
charge.
anorexia.
There is a kind of moral charge to fasting today. It is not morally acceptable to be overweight in this society.
But it was, and just to respond to you, I would think, to me, it was the same because it's all about control, right? These women had no control of their lives. One thing they could control was their food. And with anorexics, it's the same thing. They feel they have no control, and the one thing they think they can control is their food. And to me, that just, like, I don't know, there was just a big connection there in my mind. But,
I think that the fact that you knew that about anorexics today probably helped. 'Cause I didn't.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's not...
Well, I mean, that might explain Peter's total lack of that connection, right? I mean, how much do you think about anorexia as a phenomenon today? I mean, it may be that that's the side
No, not
that's...
so much in high school I did, but not so much anymore.
Well, I mean, I think it is easier for us, aside from the merits of the historian and their agenda, I think that sort of all other things being equal, it's easier for us to make the connections if the gap of time is less than if the gap of time is more. Right? Yeah, go ahead,
I
Greg.
mean, how much, I mean, Dower's argument there, to me, seems very plausible because 50s to 80s, you're looking at the people who grew up in the 50s now being in charge of the 80s. I mean, it's the same generation even. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, their thoughts obviously, just off the top of your head, would be obviously influenced. I mean, over a few hundred years, you would think that just time dilutes it, basically. I mean, but even if it was, you know, World War I to the 80s, you would be like, well, that's, I mean, even that different
All you had to
generation-
do was talk to your grandparents.
Right. I mean, but even then, you would say like, well, that's a little different than I actually grew up and was 20 and now I'm 50 and in
Right.
charge. You know, I think
Okay.
that makes Dower's point a lot stronger.
Okay, I mean, it is certainly more plausible, again, all other things being equal, that that let's say visual discourses or narrative discourses or even social scientific discourses about race, let's just take Dower's example, that you grow up with will still be percolating around in the back of your head, right? Even if you've been, so-called re-educated by time and changes in political circumstance and so on and so forth, right? Because we expect the individual as an autonomous being to maintain their own history, right? In addition to all the other things that come flying at them. Whereas nobody is around today who can say, oh yes, I talked to Saint Barbara, right? Or my grandmother knew Saint Barbara, right? It's so far back that there's no personal connection at all. So if Bynum is going to make the connection that Jeff suggested we might all be in the profession because of, right? We're trying to understand ourselves. If Bynum wants to understand us, or she wants us to read her book and better understand ourselves, she's going to have to work harder at convincing us that it's relevant than John Dower is, right? All other things being equal. It may also be that John Dower does a better job of it than Bynum, right? But we're going to have to be really careful in how we tease that out because the jobs turn out to be very different. Yeah, Peter.
What was that? I just completely forgot.
When it comes back,
Okay.
jump in right away. Okay, Anne-Marie.
But Bynum, even in the epilogue, she does mention modern occurrences of religious fasting. So, I mean, it's not a phenomenon that's disappeared from our culture, I think. So
Yeah, I would agree that it's still with us.
And fasting's fasting for religious purposes is one of the few acceptable reasons to do extreme fasts in our world.
Well, and maybe political, right? I mean, it's the hunger strike
Hunger
still
strikes are still
a high moral cause. I
Yeah.
think the hunger
But I
strike is a
mean,
high moral cause.
But I mean, those are truly the only reasons that you're allowed to fast like that. Because I mean,
Who's the guy who put himself up in the box, the plexiglass box in London?
But he did that
That's
for
hardly
money.
political.
It was art, right? Was it art?
And he cheated,
He was
apparently.
showing off.
Oh, he cheated?
What?
But apparently he ate in between.
In between what?
Peter's crash.
He had like, I think there was talk
Now I
he
need
had
a
a
new
blanket
idol.
or something where he was.
Oh, where he had chips. Well, of course, he wasn't a woman, right? I mean, it's the women who have sort of the real fortitude for this thing. We know from Bynum. Yeah, Peter is.
I kind of remember too.
Okay.
I mean, when you're looking over such long time periods, the whole world was different. I mean, Lewis makes the whole point that perceptions of of not only a society but of the entire universe were completely different. And I mean, Bynum's book was from 1100s, 1200s when Lewis was writing about the medieval model of the universe. So everything, it's really hard to make comparisons from one place to another when their whole concept of what is and what's true and what's fact is completely different than what we believe today.
Okay, so can we go back to Jeff's apologia for becoming a historian? Was that what that was?
That's a nicer word than tirade, sure.
Jeff suggested that one really compelling reason to be a historian is that it helps you understand the present. If that's the case, should we expect that that people who have a strong predilection for wanting to understand the present through the past should study the more recent past, and people who have a weaker predilection for wanting to, pursue the past for the study of the present should get more remote in time, and eventually, right? I mean, and eventually they have to all be antiquarians, the classicists, right? I mean, we have this, historians, I think it's safe to say, have a deep suspicions about classicists, right? Are they, can they really be historians, or are they really sort of a separate thing? In fact, there are sort of two names for them. They can be classicists or they can be ancient historians.
What's the difference?
Ah, well, there's a big difference. It's just I'll have trouble articulating it to you. I know it when I see it, but I can't describe it to save myself.
Josh Stosen, he's an ancient historian.
Yeah, he was properly an ancient historian, don't you think?
Well,
yeah, but that was a terrible loss for us, right? We might get stuck with the classicist in replacement, but
And Steve Ostro counts as...
He's an antiquarian. I think he's more of a...
I hope that wasn't said with great condescension.
He's wonderful.
Well, but there's a reason why classics has a more fraught understanding, right, of itself as a discipline, and it's partly because it is yet further back in time, right? And so there are perhaps a greater mix of things that draw people to it. Although, obviously, one could be an ancient historian and make the claims that Jeff just made. I'm an ancient historian because I want to understand the present through the mirror of the past.
Well, you could also say that historians' problems with classicists are a classic case of patricide, in the sense that, one way of thinking about history in the Western tradition is that it starts with those guys back then, Thucydides and Herodotus, and is refracted through a Renaissance, which may have happened in the 12th century or may have happened in the 15th or 16th century, and which has been left behind at the beginning of the 20th century, and therefore we have to reject it. So, the problem lies as much with historians, whoever they are, as it does with classicists, whoever they are.
Right. I don't know which one of you, but...
This was my original comment.
Well, let's get it quick.
I guess it's more of a question to Professor Ravel, is that you say you want to superimpose the past on modern day to better understand ourselves, but I think we've discussed that that's probably harder to do over the long time periods. So when I've done a lot of my research, it's easy to make connections between 10, 20-year time periods. So I do a lot of military history, and I see that people don't change their strategy, and then they wind up walking right into a trap. And as Nick said, the people who grew up in the 50s were doomed in the 80s, or in the 80s are doomed now. So is that another possible reason that people become historians, is if you can make the connections in history over shorter time periods to apply them today?
Well, I think I would say two things in response to that. First, I would say that another way that historians have of being incredibly condescending, and I was sort of doing it kiddingly with Ben when I talked about U.S. historians, is to suggest that anything that's less than 100 years old is really journalism and not history at all. But the truth behind that condescension and silly thing to say is that in some senses, we can learn a lot more about ourselves by looking at Bynum's crazy fasting women and saying, that is so far out of the realm, how can we possibly think our way back into the mindset either of those women or of the people who wrote chronicles about them that Bynum is relying on? And in that act of real disparity, of otherness that we acknowledge in reading about this, that we can also learn a lot about ourselves, our society, the world that we live in today. The other thing I was going to say is that I've sort of toyed with or been tempted to write this article about what is history that I would call between anachronism and antiquarianism. To me, that's the sort of two poles of what the historian tries to do. The antiquarian cares not at all for the present and wants to lose him or herself entirely in the past and block out the present. The anachronist is incapable of appreciating past phenomenon on their own merits, can only understand and accept or reject through the lens of the present. I think what the good historian does, and hopefully what all of us have done today, and certainly in the other readings that Professor McCants has given you, is to find the balancing act between the two, and to be a little bit of the anachronist and a little bit of the antiquarian whenever necessary, but to have an appreciation for both past and present in trying to construct these narratives.
What were you going to say, Miranda?
I think there's a lot of what I've seen is like I've done some study in terms of psychology and stuff and some historical psychology, and I think that it's not just sort of getting the history of you study history to figure out the society of nowadays, but it's looking at these fasting women as individual people, and you either go okay, well, obviously I would have done that, I mean not with the fasting women, but like you get this with other people, like I love classic histories and stuff like that, and I probably am an antiquarian completely, but but like I'll read some of these ones and it'll be like they'll make the woman will do something and I'll just like, well, it just somehow like connects with a lot of what I'll either see of myself or like as interpersonal relationships between people I've seen around, or like the psychology of what people are now actually systematically studying, trying to do experiments for. And I feel like you can do a lot of that just from looking at what these things, in the history you have that of the psychology of how people have both changed, and it's not. It gets very much affected by like what is their belief in the universe. But there's a lot of the feeling of humans' ideas don't change, but human nature doesn't, and sort of I think that
ideas do change.
Ideas change, but human nature doesn't, and so it's sort of whether or not that's true or not, and going through history figuring that out.
Well, let me ask you a completely. Was there any other hands up? No. Okay. Let me ask you a completely off the wall question, and this is something I've actually thought a lot about, and it comes out of my interests in big questions about standard of living, and I've done a lot of work on diets and sort of the material manifestations of welfare. And you've seen, sort of a side piece of that. But anyway, and the question is this: is pain historically constructed or socially constructed? That is my experience of pain as somebody who lives in the 21st century the same or different than someone's experience of pain who, say, lived in the 4th century? And how could I think about that problem? In other words, is pain real and true for all time as a human experience, or is it mediated?
Didn't we talk about the binary piece?
Yeah. We must have. It's an issue that really, really, really interests me. But it strikes me as so problematic precisely because it speaks to the core problem of being a historian, right? If we, I had a colleague who once said that the only historical fact that is absolutely certain is death. Okay, that's taxes. Taxes are highly mediated, let me tell you. And the point there is that when the subject is dead, the subject is really dead. Of course.
Not Martin Gare.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's true. But, I mean, at least to sort of our level of comfort standards. And some people would say, if the subject is starving, the subject is really starving. If the subject is in pain, the subject is really in pain, right? They would add, things like pain and starvation or whatever to the set of the facts that we can be comfortable with. Others would not. And I think how we think about those kinds of questions will inform to a great deal how we think about this sort of, the way that Jeff has posed the problem. Are we antiquarians or are we anachronists? Because it has something to do with what we think is really true and immutable versus what we think is possibly open to change. Right? And the more of the human experience that we can put into the immutable category, then the better able we are to make the big leaps. Right? If I think lots of human experience is immutable, it's driven by our biology, by our sensory experience, by the fact that we're made up of cells. Presumably our cells and the cells of Walker Bynum's subjects are the same, right? They had the same kind of configuration of atoms and nuclei and right? And the more I believe that that kind of experience stays the same over time, then the easier it's going to be for me to make these bigger connections, right? If I think that all kinds of stuff is socially mediated or historically mediated or subject to change over time, then it gets both harder and more interesting, right? And this is a question we can't answer. We can argue about it, we can feel strongly and passionately about it, we can disagree completely, and both sides be completely convinced that they're right, but the truth of the matter is we can't settle it.
So do you have some ideas for where you're going to look about your history of pain?
Well, all of this bioarchaeology stuff actually, I think, speaks to this question really well. This sort of bioarchaeology is another good example of those two disciplines, history and biology, taking over the rest of the academy. The bioarchaeologists are collecting all of this skeletal material, and they're doing all kinds of fun forensic stuff. They're assessing hypoplasias on the teeth and evidence of iron deficiency anemia in the bone structure, and they're looking at violence, right? The presence of bullet holes in skulls and, arrow tips embedded in bones and all kinds of, amazingly cool stuff, right? If you can go to just like one history talk a year, you should go hear a bioarchaeologist because they have good slides and, they tell great stories and exactly. My reading of that literature, and I've actually been trying to read a lot in it because it's so endlessly fascinating to me, my reading of that is that pain probably is historically mediated. Because if I sort of catalog that set of experiences that are recorded in the bone structure, and I think about continuing to work and all kinds of other stuff, right? Or when we read Bynum and we think, what were these people doing? Cutting themselves up and flagellating themselves and starving themselves and, having such severe gastrointestinal pain. Well, duh, you haven't eaten for 7 years. Of course you're going to have gastrointestinal pain, right? But, if we think about that kind of evidence, to me anyway, it's suggestive of modifications in the human experience. Or at least modifications from one person to another, whether they have a historical component too. Another former colleague of mine at one point, in a most disparaging comment, because he didn't approve of the kind of history I did at all, said to me after a talk, he said, I suppose you're going to try to tell me next that starvation is socially constructed. And he said it with just dripping sarcasm and contempt. And I don't remember what I said. Probably like, you buffoon, go away.
And eventually he did.
And he did.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's throw out one last question. So what do you think happens when all these historians like get together and drink too much? Or what I really meant was when they have faculty meetings. That's what I meant to say. So I mean, how do we talk to each other? How do we talk to each other?
We talk about baseball.
Jeff tries, but you see, we don't all share that passion either. Some of us hold baseball in utter contempt. Utter contempt. I can say that anywhere I want. In fact, since you've asked, you haven't asked, but the best thing about Jeff is that he has periodically taken my children to a baseball game, so that I don't have to. All right, so go home and think about that. When disciplines are this fractured, if you will, how do they talk to each other? I don't need all of them back, but I need at least like one of them back. Otherwise, I'll have no single copy. That was my concern.
No, I think the real question is what happens when a country's national pastime started in another country.
That's right.
Where did baseball start? Where did it start? Where did baseball start?
Well, it's worse.
Did it really?